You're a good ambassador.
Yeah.
I'm sure we're going to have a few stragglers, but we'll get started. If you want to say something, and I'm probably going to say come back up here, especially if it's a really good question or comment, I'll have you come stand closer to the computer so we can make sure to get it forever on tape. Here you go. All right. So welcome to Wanted Social Workers on the Hill, Networking for 2016. Hello also to everyone who's watching us online and who will be watching it archived later. If you don't know anything about me at all, my name is Kristie Holmes, and I'm a Twitter evangelist, trying to get everyone at this conference on Twitter, and whoever thought that would be the thing I'm trying to do. But it is, to me, one of the most important things to do to get us networked the next year. I think it's important that we get started today without really long bios, so I'm going to have us introduce each other and just talk to each other and to the audience, because I want to hear questions, comments, and even arguments. I love argument. So if you have something to say that doesn't necessarily agree with what we're thinking, tell us, because everybody's communities work differently. I wanted to convene this panel today because I really wish, in hindsight, that my MSW program did more around these topics, because I didn't have much interest and I didn't feel like it mattered that much. And I feel like most of my current students in the last 2 years don't feel like their vote matters either, even if they vote. They kind of do it out of duty. So, first, we're going to have Linda, and then we're going to have Tanya. I do have slides up here. Angela is our executive director for CRISP, and she's online right now, monitoring everybody on the Hangout and on YouTube. Her Twitter handle is on here, so I made sure to put Twitter handles for the speakers, so you can tweet about it. And if you don't know what you're doing on Twitter, you can tweet about it after, but you'll have all this information will be online too. So first we have Linda. I just had us put a small comment on why we're here and the affiliations for those of you who care about who and what we're affiliated with. We have Tanya Rhodes Smith, and she's expert on campaigns, which I knew. I wish I would have met her before and had gone to campaign school, but for everybody else, they'll be able to do that. So, and this is me. I believe in networking for change, like I said, and I ran for Congress last year. And I'm hoping to get more social workers to do so. So first, we're going to start with Linda. And go ahead and introduce yourself briefly, a minute or two. And
Let's go on.
Yep, and then we're going to switch back to what you're here for and do your overview. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, okay, and what you do.
Okay.
And then we'll go to Tanya.
Okay. So I'm Linda Plitt Donaldson, and I'm the chair of the Social Change Concentration at Catholic University. And I've been a Catholic for 13 years. But before that, I worked for 10 years with people who were homeless, and I was the director of a public policy, we called it advocacy program, for 8 of those 10 years. Working actually in local, state level, DC level, we're a state, DC level work, and always including, trying to be intentional about including the people we serve. Because as I tell my social change students, what differentiates us as social workers doing policy advocacy work is that we ground our work in the human experience, right? In the suffering of vulnerable people, so that we need to be in touch with them as much as possible and include them in the process. So I believe very strongly in engaging the people we serve in the policy making process, as well as us being involved as well.
Wonderful. Tanya.
I'm Tanya Rhodes Smith, and I am the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work. And I attended UConn and served as an intern with the Institute back in 1998 before I became a lobbyist for a low-income children's advocacy group. And I've been involved with the Institute ever since. And Nancy A. Humphreys, who is the founder of the Institute, mentored many of us, and some of us are in this room. And I always thought that every school had macro practice as a major part of what it did. And every school thought about political advocacy the same way that UConn does. So I feel very fortunate. I feel strongly that voting is social work, and that community and that social workers should be empowering communities and the people that they serve to vote, because voting as a practice is very good for social workers, that Linda will or for people, and Linda will talk a little bit more about that. What did I miss? That was just
Yeah, that's fine. That's perfect. Charles Lewis, will you come up here for a minute and introduce yourself and let us know what Kristie is doing as far as legislative placements and activities like social work down the hill? Take a minute or two.
I'll take a minute. Okay. My name is Charles Lewis Jr. I started CRISP, Congressional Research Institute for Social Worker Policy, in January of 2013 when Congressman Towns retired. I had been working for Congressman Towns for about 3 years. And while we were on here, we formed the Congressional Social Work Caucus, which included the 8 members of Congress who were social workers, but also people who wanted to support professions. So we have about 70 members of the caucus. I think there's about 61 members, and as I speak. So when we were leaving the Hill, we created this CRISP because I knew that caucuses do not have resources, and if there's no one out there trying to prodding them and getting them to do something, they would be dormant. We didn't want the social work caucus dormant. So we created CRISP, and we've done a number of things. We've done briefings. In fact, we'll be doing a briefing on the Hill November 18th with the McSilver Institute at NYU. They did a report on the trauma of racism, and they're going to talk about that report and tie it to the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. So those are some of the things we're doing. We also are trying to encourage congressional offices to take interns, particularly in their district office. So we're about getting more social workers involved with the federal government.
Perfect, Charles, thank you. Also, Social Work Day on the Hill, which was a huge success last year. We're doing it again in March.
March 7th, 8th, and 9th.
March 8th and 9th. All right, so back to Linda. Why engage the people we serve?
Okay.
Jump off right there.
Okay, so we should not forget, right, that the people we serve are the true experts on the problem, right? They should be part of the process. They not only know what it's like to be poor or homeless or in child welfare, they actually know what the solution should be, right? So we should be engaging them and helping determine what the policy should be saying, how they should be crafted. As I said in my introduction, this is really what distinguishes social work from public policy or law or MPAs or other people who might do some advocacy work, policy work. There are a lot of wonderful public interest lawyers who do ground their work and people who are suffering. But this is what defines social work, right? Is that's who we're with. So that's part of our code of ethics. Our code of ethics speaks to our responsibility to be with people who are poor and people who are vulnerable, to promote social justice and social change, and to give attention to these more disadvantaged populations because of really the structural problems. Also, another good reason is because it might actually result in better utilization of public policies and programs. I'll never forget one of my students a few years ago saying, Dr. Donaldson, we developed this whole fatherhood initiative and not a single father participated because we got all this money because we were all about fathers. And I said, well, did you invite any dads to help? No, we didn't actually. Well, okay, so it might actually result in better utilization, more effective policies, better outcomes, right, of our work. And let me also tell you, policymakers are tired of professional advocates. I did this work at the state level in DC for many, many years, and I'll never forget when we were trying to advance the interim disability assistance program after they cut GPA, general assistance for people, and we were thinking, okay, a more sympathetic population might be people with disabilities who are waiting for their SSI, and we were very active and formed coalitions and actually had people who would have been recipients, but it's hard to get people, right, to come during the daytime. Sometimes the policy process is not accessible. But one of the policymakers said, well, where are the people who need this? I see all these professional advocates. Where are the people? And I think that's exactly right. It was wonderful actually to hear that question. So those are some of the reasons, you need to bring the constituents, the people who are constituents of the legislators to the legislative body. Sometimes people say, well, how do we do this? How do we engage people we serve? So hopefully at first you recognize their competence. You already recognize that they're competent, that they are the experts. So you have to have the mindset that we're doing this with people, not for people, that we're doing this with people. So how do you do it? How do you get started? So if you're working as a social worker in a community-based agency, you could start by just having a group, right? Having a current events group or a group that's talking about concerns. That's what we did. I mean, I started in social work, working in low-income housing, and within 6 months I started organizing people, right? And it all started because people started coming to me talking about common concerns, so I formed a group, and we advocated and organized and made policy change. We saved a housing subsidy. The residents saved their bus stop when the city was cutting the bus stop in the community, right? So it all began by starting a group of people talking about what was happening, raising their consciousness, not me raising it, but each other raising their consciousness that we don't deserve this. People were saying, oh, this is how it is for us. This is how it is for Black people in DC. No, it isn't. Other Black people in DC were saying, so together they were raising each other's consciousness that we shouldn't be living like this and that we should take control and try to make these changes. So you form a group. You talk about common concerns, you develop a plan, right? An advocacy goal, a plan to achieve that goal, concrete steps, you support people in all of these things, and then you implement it, right? It's not rocket science, but it takes dedicated, sustained, persistent effort with people and supporting people, right? So we formed a group. I was present, and I provided TA, technical assistance, in between meetings so that they would, have competence. It's also kind of a leadership development piece, right? You're helping people develop and feel confident, and self-efficacy, right? Self-efficacy, that I can actually successfully run a meeting. I can actually successfully take notes about a meeting. I can actually successfully give testimony at a hearing, and you practice these things in advance. So you're not just throwing people out there, you're working with people, right? So this could be a way that you could help engage the people we serve. If you're not in a community-based context, you partner with people. That's another good way. Or if you're working in a Hill placement, maybe you make it, or a legislative placement, maybe you make an effort to go into communities and have these conversations with people who are suffering, right? Because sometimes it's not as easy, and we get caught up in our day-to-day work that we don't. It's hard to be grounded, right? But we have to be intentional. That has to be an intentional part of our work. So that's another how. So on to the next slide. So some other specific ways. So holding a group is my favorite way. What I just said, that's my favorite way, because it's sustained. You work on issues. If you get through one, you work on the next. You're building leadership. It's a very good way of integrating and institutionalizing social change activities with the people you serve. Other ways you could do it. Tanya mentioned voter, having voters registration drives, and everybody in your agency can do that. You have it in your mental health program, your substance abuse program, your housing program, your family program. Everybody should be, at the screening, you could be handing out voters registration information and collecting that, and turning that in. Even taking people to the polls, we would get buses, or cars, and take people on voting day, right? Because some people had disabilities and couldn't go, or older adults and they couldn't go, they had some transportation issues, and sometimes the buses didn't run on time. You provide nonpartisan voter education information. You're talking about the issues. One of the best things we ever did is we held a candidates forum, and the residents did it. I was just saying, hey, what about inviting all the candidates to this low-income housing program, and they went around and they collected questions from the residents of the building. And the residents actually ran and people came. Actually, some of the candidates came, and we talked about, what if they don't come? What does that mean? Well, that's a statement, right? Do they care about your issues? Do they care about the needs of low-income people? And the residents ran it. They moderated it. I wasn't involved. I mean, I was involved, but behind the scenes. And the day of the candidates forum, I wasn't really involved. I was just there being present. They moderated it. They asked the questions. They pushed back. It was such an empowering thing. When it was over, the euphoria in the room about what they had accomplished at the end of this candidates forum was phenomenal. And they invited people from other programs. So candidates forums are great things, and also educating candidates on the issues. Taking people down to your city council office or the executive branch and talking about what it's like to be homeless, what it's like to be, to experience the problem, and also, but not just telling their story. A lot of social workers are comfortable with clients telling their story, and that's good, and that can be empowering, but also give them, help them build the competence to be the one that's talking about the statistics. What are the statistics on homelessness in our city? What are the racial disparities, the income disparity, all those things. You don't have to be an academic to talk about statistics and that kind of stuff. And then another way is just with the candidates. That year we also had those voters register, those cards, report cards. How did they support? How did they vote on homelessness? How did they speak out on homelessness? And holding them accountable. And actually, we've been really successful in DC. Mayor Bowser, our current mayor, the homeless services community went to every single one of her events and got her to give commitments to homelessness. And we're actually, as a city, really for the first time, I've been there for over 20 years, we're actually making some inroads related to homelessness. And part of it is because I think of the advocacy community and the people who are homeless holding her accountable to that. The nonprofit vote, you should go to the website, because if you ever get resistance in your agencies or in your workplaces about why should we, how is this having a therapeutic benefit? Because some people, that kind of language works for them. They have some good material on, they've done some studies that looks at what the benefits are of voting. Not only does it give people power, right? It helps them feel like they've done something, they've accomplished something. It does promote connectedness, right? So we all know in social work, the importance of human relationships, that's one of our core values, right? So having this voting activity, you're taking people down together, you're talking about voting together, it promotes a social connectedness, a social bondedness. I already mentioned the idea of self-efficacy, right? That we want people to feel empowered. It also makes us relevant. They feel like, why should I listen? Why should I pass interim disability assistance? Why should I do anything about homelessness, put money into more affordable housing? Because people who are homeless don't vote. Well, if they start seeing people who are homeless at the polls, it makes them more relevant. It makes the nonprofit community more relevant because we're taking an active role in getting our program participants involved in the political process. Nonprofit Vote has done some work looking at the link between voting and self-reported health outcomes, right? So self-reported health is an important indicator of good health, they say, in the public health community. That's a good measure, a good indicator of health. And also, I mentioned the idea about raising consciousness. So voting together is an activity that we do together. We're being good role models for one another, right? That voting does matter. And again, if we're relevant, it gives us a seat at the table, and it gives the people we serve, meaning us and the people we serve. So we have a group in our community called Project Action, and it's people with disabilities who are advocating for themselves. And now the mayor, and over the past several years, and subsequent mayors make sure that people from Project Action are sitting at the various tables, because they became so noisy about, this whole thing, nothing about us without us, the whole campaign. They have been very successful and are present in all the mayor's committees and commissions. And it's not just one, it's two or three. You have to populate these meetings, because it's hard. It's a lonely, challenging thing to be sitting on these commissions with these people of different statuses, right? So you have to populate that. But it's important to get our folks at the table in meaningful, institutionalized ways. I think I'm out of time, so.
Well, it also gives you some time to speak with the audience, or if you have any comments or questions about anything she's put forward. Is there anything that you do in your own community that reflects what she's been talking about, or how would you implement it? So now we have educators here, we have nonprofit folks here, we have students here. So how do you engage? Have you engaged? Are you here because you want to engage? We want to record you, so. Anybody have questions for her?
No.
Talk loud, Mark.
Just a variety of ways. I worked with one organization that in the waiting room, we put this big arrow And that's all it was. It's a big arrow. And then there was a table that had a couple simple things for them to register to vote and to get some information on issues. And that was about it. It was a real simple thing, but it was in the waiting room. And we also put on the waiting room chairs different pieces, some of that same material, so that people had, they actually had to pick it up and move it to sit down, and so they were touching it. Then also doing leadership training activities run by the people, train the folks to run it, and then they ran it. So those are some of the things that worked out. Simple things worked out well.
Purple then blue.
So because they're requested in vulnerable groups and you're trying to get them involved, which is great, but how do you deal with issues of confidentiality around that? Because these people are vulnerable and you can't just put them in a spotlight. I mean, developing their skills is great and doing that is great, but the rest, I don't know. It seems like there'd be some issues of confidentiality.
You're raising actually an important issue related to that is, say you're protesting, right? You're going to a rally or a protest, and you might have people who might have bench warrants, right? They might not even know, right? Or you might be organizing people who are undocumented. It's really important to check all these things out and to discuss sort of the risk factors and explore with them. And it's not like you're just meeting these people for the first time, right? I mean, there needs to be a sustained institutionalized program, right? That you can't just do these things and mobilize people and send them out there, but you have to educate them about what the risks are, especially when you're doing civil disobedience or protests. Mark mentioned having a regular institutionalized political education. We also instituted that. We had a 10-week political education program for residents, by residents largely, and they talked about the importance of voting. And actually, from an African American perspective, they were talking about what their ancestors did, to have the rights, to have voting rights, and that we have a responsibility. They were saying with their own voices why we had to be doing this. And we practice, what would letter writing look like? We had, just practice those things. What would giving testimony, all these different types of tactics that you might do if you're advocating for political change. We had field trips. We went to the Hill and visited Holmes Norton. We went to our city council member just to build relationship, to demystify and help them feel comfortable with people and not think of them as celebrities. That's one of my things, is people think of politicians as celebrities, and they're not. They work for us. But in that process, you're getting to know people and you're helping them understand the risks and benefits. And, if they are telling their story, I mean, that's a good point. They could have experienced some traumatic activities that could spur, so you're with them and you're present to them, and there are resources available to them if it triggers something that they need to talk to somebody. So I think I really appreciate that question.
Hi, I'm passionate about this issue. One of the things I'm passionate about through my review of literature is that I think the literature shows that voter registration is great, but yet there's still this gap, even in years when we've had record-breaking voter registration, that hasn't reflected to actual voting. And so you mentioned that briefly in terms of perhaps driving people there, and I think also we know that when people have connections, they're more likely to vote. But do you have any recommendations for helping people get to the next step and getting registered voters to the polls?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Tanya.
A little bit about this, because we're doing a model right now, a pilot at both UConn and the University of Nevada, Reno, where we are partnering with Nonprofit Vote, and we really are defining voter engagement as being registration, nonpartisan education, and outreach. And Nonprofit Vote, again, they did a 2012 study that really identified the fact that being told to vote by somebody that you trust is the best way to get people to the polls. So the political parties we know are completely ignoring non-voters. Right. So how do we engage those voters? And we really believe that these agency settings are are where it needs to happen. And it's not a one-time event. It's not an election. It is creating a culture of voting that people, every time you touch a person in your agency, are you asking them, are you registered to vote? Are you asking them if they have moved? Are you giving them the tools that they need? Are you promoting elections? Are you educating them on who is on the ballot? I mean, I think sometimes just knowing who's on the ballot is empowering or gives somebody the confidence to get to the polls. So we've been thinking a lot about that.
So for your strategies, from what you're aware of, working with nonprofits,
Yep.
is there a plan that can be replicated in other agencies of how on election day or right before election day to get those folks out to the polls?
To the actual polls,
Yeah.
you're talking about the
Or just
transportation.
remind them, or whatever it is, just
I think it's a
something concrete that
community-based
you can
effort.
recommend to us.
I think it's a community effort, and one of the things I'll mention is we're starting a project which I hope to pull you into at in Norwich, where the mayor of Norwich is a social worker, and we are meeting with very large the largest organizations, nonprofits in that city, and both of the executive directors are on board, really want to create this culture of voting, and then how do we create a collaborative that really is meaningful? How do we pull back in the League of Women Voters that in some communities that voice is gone? Who are the players that we need to involve to get people to the polls and to answer some of the questions so that we can actually say that the ultimate impact obviously is whether or not they voted.
I'm gonna have Tanya go through the rest of her slides. I know that we'll start asking questions that she's covering, so go ahead.
All right. Well, I'll back up a little and I'll try not to be redundant. So at the Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work, Nancy Humphreys has been thinking about this work for many years and is a pioneer, and as I said, mentored many of us. And at the Institute, we have a couple of things. We think that all social workers should be participating in the political process. And if you think about the political process as a continuum, voting being on one end, and perhaps elected office, but even depending on where you are in that continuum, it can be voting, it can be contacting legislators, it can be organizing a group, it can be doing voter registration. It's influencing the process, but voting doesn't influence policy directly. We also want people to be thinking about ways they can influence the policy. And so how do you give them the skills to do that? So one of the things that we've been doing is teaching giving basic political advocacy to every MSW social worker, MSW student in their first year. So we do that. And we also think about the other skills that they need. I mean, I can tell you from teaching political advocacy that if the first year I taught it, I know that testifying in front of a municipal government, at a municipal hearing or at the state legislature can be really hard for students. So the first year I taught that course, I didn't actually make them do it. I said, you can write the testimony and that's enough. Well, then the next year when I actually mandated them to testify, it was a completely different experience for students. And actually it taught me an important lesson about this work, is that actually touching it and doing it is really important to that. And the other thing that we think a lot about at the Institute is political social work as a practice setting and as a specialization within the field. So that getting social workers to understand that there's more than one definition of social work, and we're not all clinicians, we shouldn't all be clinicians. And we talk a lot about macro, and yes, I mean I firmly believe that macro social work is micro and macro, but also sometimes social workers don't even know all the things that they're qualified to do, or they don't think about it. So one, we want to give them the skills and then get them to understand it. So one of the things that we create, knowing that this political efficacy, this perceived self-efficacy for political action is the predictor of political activity, Nancy Humphreys started the campaign school 20 years ago to get social workers to run for office. And this year, or I'm sorry, in March will be our 20th anniversary of that campaign school. And we have trained over 600 people to run for office in a 2-day training. And we know that one of the most important outcomes for the training is the fact that we've got people in elected office who are doing fantastic jobs. We have 2 mayors that are social workers in our state, but not only that, we have people that have run, but we have people who are working in political settings. So they, for instance, in our U.S. senators, we've got Senator Chris Murphy and we've got Senator Richard Blumenthal. Both of them have 3 social workers on their staff. And it's almost a competition between the 2 because one social worker just left to go work with the public policy, the legislative director for the VA. Well, she wants to make sure that she's filled by a social worker because it really is a competition. And those kinds of opportunities create students future field placements and mentors, and they all come back to the campaign school. So the campaign school is not only giving skills to students, but it is also building this bigger network of political social work. And the campaign school is a 2-day format, the way it stands now. And the first day is taught by a master trainer. Kate Coyne McCoy ran for Congress in Rhode Island. She used to be an NASW chapter director, and she's worked for Emily's List, and she has a long-time relationship with Hartford. And she is a fantastic trainer, and we believe, or we know that there are people that walk into the campaign school saying, I am never running for office. I took this as a course. I am not interested in running. And they leave thinking, I could do this. And even if they don't do it, we know that they're more likely to volunteer for campaigns. They're more likely to get their foot in the door and be politically active. And a lot of those skills, when you think about campaign, fundraising, public speaking, messaging, those are all skills that translate to other settings too. So this isn't just about running for office, but we give them really experiential skill or the opportunity to use these skills during that day so that then they're more likely to take them into practice. And then the second day is all about building the network. So, and getting them, they get to see and talk to political social workers who are in elected office and hear what it's like. And we don't give them the fairy tale story. We dig deep. You know, what's your worst mistake, or what are your ethical conflicts in office? You know, so that they can understand that they're just like you and me. All of us. There's no perfect person to run for office, that we can all do it. And that whole day is designed around giving students that exposure to these political social work settings and skills.
Wonderful. I'm sure you have questions for her too. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to ask her something now?
Does anyone have any questions about the campaign school?
Well, I apologize for coming in late. I'm tweeting her what you're doing. And I don't know if you covered or intend to cover the fact that 501c3 organizations clearly can lobby.
Yes.
And if that's something that you are intending to talk about, because I'd be happy to talk about it.
Well, you probably know the specifics. I mean, I was a lobbyist for 501c3, so I know that and it's been a while since I've done that, but you can absolutely do it unless it crosses a threshold.
I'll talk about it for 30 seconds, then I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But the IRS has a qualification that you can't spend a substantial amount of money, so they haven't defined that all that well, unless you file to be a Part H organization or one-page thing. It's very easy to do, and then you can spend 20% of your first $100,000 on direct lobbying. And that's defined in very limited ways. So there's a lot that you can do that is not even called direct lobbying. There's a provision for grassroots lobbying, it's a little bit more restrictive. But clearly, you can spend money on lobbying as a 501c3. So I just want to dispel that, because I get that throughout. We're a nonprofit, we can't lobby. That's not true.
And we have MSW students who go on to work for the larger lobbyists. one of our MSW students is now the executive director of the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women, and she was a lobbyist for many years.
Can I just add, just to build on, thank you for raising this, Mark, but there is a big difference. I talk about this in my class. I have a whole, probably an hour on this issue, making distinctions between lobbying and advocacy. As Mark said, there's a very specific definition of lobbying, which is about persuading somebody in office, a decision maker, to take a position on a piece of legislation, right? So a lot of the work that we're doing in our community-based agencies and social workers is educating people about issues, not necessarily to take a position on an issue, right? But just educating what is what is poverty, the issues of poverty, homelessness, child abuse, neglect, whatever it is. But you're not talking about an issue per se. So, and also, there's a lot of the work that you're doing in policy work is enforcement. It's making people do what the law says they have to do in the first place, right? So, there's just, you could have a whole session on this, but it's important for you to spend some time, and Mark will talk to you about it afterward, and I will. I have a presentation at 2, so I can't stay after, but to really understand and disabusing 501c3s about the notion that they can't do advocacy or lobbying because there's so much freedom. I saw Catherine.
I was just going to add that, at least in my home state of Minnesota, our Secretary of State has a specific person to go out and train nonprofits on how they can be involved in advocacy, what the expectations are, what the sort of limits are of 501c3 status. And he has come out and done training with my students in my policy classes so that they can then carry it back to their field settings. And has written a special letter for them that they can bring with them. So if people say, I don't believe you, he has a letter from the Secretary of State of Minnesota saying, no, here, I know you're gonna ask this question. Here it is, but so it might be worth, I didn't know this guy existed until I happened to call the office and they were like, oh, Jeff can come out and do that for you. So it might be worth a call. Who knows, maybe it's in other states.
Yeah.
Just get Jeff, let's put Jeff on that stand, Jeff.
We all need Jeff. Every state needs Jeff.
Jeff is amazing. He came and did a 2-hour training in my policy class on how to do some favors.
Well, and I think just to note that all kinds of voter engagement is legal too in nonprofit settings. It's nonpartisan.
That's right.
Voter registration, education, and outreach is absolutely legal for 501c3s. There is a very, very small contingent of block grant money that can't be used towards it, but it's largely okay. And as a matter of fact, most agencies don't know it, but under the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, called the Motor Voter, where we all get the opportunity to register to vote when we go for our driver's license, that mandates that when agencies are signing people up for public assistance, so temporary assistance for needy families, WIC, food stamps, Medicaid, that they have to be given the opportunity to register to vote. And many agencies don't. I think largely the state agencies are doing this work, but nonprofits who are doing this work don't always know it and aren't always doing it. And I always like to make the distinction that there's a difference between handing someone a form as a routine kind of, to creating a culture of voting. So, there's a lot we can do there. There's a couple of organizations. We have a former intern who works for an organization called Demos that does nothing but enforce the 1993 Act, and they just filed a big suit in Nevada for not complying with that law. So thanks, Mark, for touching on that. Any other questions on the campaign school? Let me just say, we will come to your school. And we have our 20th anniversary in March. So if you are interested in sending students, please see me. We have lots of universities that come, and it's a fantastic event. Students really like it, and I can give you ideas on how to make that happen. I think I've got one more. Do you want me to keep going? Oh, sorry about. I just wanted can I touch on just the model for schools of social work? Because it ties into all of this, and I won't go into it, but through that work that we're trying to create a model for schools of social work. The end game is really development of materials that everybody can use, whether it's videos, webinars, letters to your field agencies. We know that embedding this into curriculum, getting all social workers to see voting as a practice, they're part of their professional practice, takes training, and it takes not just in the classroom, but they have to actually do it, has to be part of an assignment. We think they have to reflect on it. So we're going through all of that, but then we're also getting buy-in from really important players like field placements that when they say, no, sorry, we don't do it, we're not mandating students do it, but we're mandating that they have a conversation about it and that they push limits and we're encouraging them and giving them the tools. Because when you think about the people who are in schools, and if you can get them, the students, to start embedding it into their practice, and then they have an impact. And I mean, you know, we're 900,000 social workers. We could change the world.
And to jump off of that, 900,000, that's in the US. And so where I end up getting frustrated, a little bit frustrated, is that we have 800,000 to 900,000 of us, depending on what stats you're looking at, that are professional social workers in the US, and we're not very networked. So 10% or less of us are networked with, say, following NASW online, on Facebook, that sort of thing. When we have such an easy, quick, free way to communicate immediately, whether it be on issues that are local or national, and we're just not doing it. I know for everyone, it's like, we don't have time, it's another thing, but this is the one thing that we could do so quickly. And this isn't even about our communities, this is just about us. So there's nearly 1 million of us that are not taking advantage of something that is so simple and so quick, especially for 2016. So our big push, really, it doesn't need to be just because it's 2016, but it's a great start. We don't have to wait for long-term studies. We don't have to spend $3 or $4 million just to find out, hey, guess what? Our communities don't vote very much. We have voter turnout rates, and we can look at those and act on those rates right now. So in your own communities, look and see what the voter turnout is. Who can we partner with? What can we do to up this? And that's something you can just do, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever kind of social worker you are, with the community, which both of you covered very well. If we want to get social workers on the Hill, we need to know when they're running. So my personal experience in doing this, I didn't have a clue. I didn't go to campaign school. I wish I did. I got my own campaign school while on the campaign trail. And I ran with 24 others. So it was really a huge experience. It was in Los Angeles. Wasn't a small district, but it was a really great learning experience. And what I learned was, as an educator, we're teaching you a lot of things in the classroom that have nothing to do with real life or what it's like to actually run for office, especially with the money, which the money could be an entirely different session another day. But the one thing I did find was that social workers, there wasn't a support system it looks like there is if you go Google it. So you can call up NASW or CSWE, no offense. But there wasn't a whole lot of support there. So the one thing I learned quickly is if you're running for federal office, there's no support for social workers running for federal office unless you get through the primary. So you have to make it to the general election, which is millions of dollars. So you need help before that. So if you want to get social workers in some of the offices we really need them in, we need the support earlier. So we can do things like ask NASW to support federal candidates in the primaries. And then that's when they really need it. And then if we want to mobilize communities, we have to know what they need to work on, but we don't need to shove it down their throats. So there might be 3 or 4 things this community may be interested in. When you start throwing out things like HR, AB, this, that, 25156, the communities start to tune out. So find something you're interested in. In LA, it might be organic food labeling. Some places it's medical marijuana. What do they care about that's going to at least get them in the door to start talking about voting? So don't get all caught up in your own thing and what they need. Find what they're interested in. So that's what I think. Our status quo is just not working right now. We can see it in our voter turnout numbers. And I just am hoping that we can all start feeling more responsible for our own communities, whether it's your classroom, the people that you serve at your agency, NGO. That group is who you're responsible for. And you're not responsible for speaking for them. And we keep mistaking our own voices because we all turn out to vote. We think we're doing something special for our communities, and we're not, because they're not voting. So a few basic stats. Almost all of us, meaning social workers, vote. Pretty much everybody votes. That's lovely. But we just did a study, and it's We just finished, so we have just very little information to share right now. But about 96% are voting, but only 3% are interested in voter mobilization, educating their communities, doing anything about getting their clients to actually vote. And one of the issues, Sunny Harris from, I think one of you earlier, she's here, but not here. She's somewhere at this conference. But she had found that a lot of social workers feel like it's unethical to talk to clients about voting. And so we just have to remember it doesn't have to be partisan. It's just about empowering them to have a voice in their own community. So it's not about getting them to vote for a certain candidate. We just need to teach them how it's important. So 10% or less said that follow NASW on social media. Chapters should be tweeting and sharing because federal issues are much different than state issues or local measures. Listservs and email blasts, and I've been hearing this for 3 days now. We do a lot of listservs, we do email. That's really closed. No one can search that online. And it's not as open to the community. So that's great for amongst ourselves, but it doesn't really network anyone. And then we don't need to spend millions to look at voter behavior. We've got the numbers, so we have to just address those numbers. We had, for the academics out there that this is important to you, we had an N of 1,354. And like I said, most vote and regularly, but the gap is just in what they do about sharing with their actual clients or the community they serve. Mental health is 55% of the focus, and we see a lot of that with even the legislative things we talk about. It's always focused on mental health. So it seems like there's a big gap in failure of social policy, and then what we spend our time, we're trying to fix things that are broken from social policies that need to be changed, like healthcare and all of that. So we just sit there and beat the drum about mental health care when we needed to have fixed a lot of the other things that are going on with the communities that we serve and find out from the community what they need in their own backyard. And the one thing I found really interesting was that only, and I put in quotes, 63% are Democrat, which for social work people are surprised. That seems a little bit low, so what are they? There aren't a lot of Republicans, there are some, but there are a lot of people moving to independent because of all the partisan politics, and we can all understand why after watching debates and such. So just have that in mind when you are recruiting people, that they don't necessarily agree with everything that you think. So try to make it as nonpartisan as possible and empowering as possible. That's about all I have. Oh, and I think a lot of people think of social media like this, where there's someone at the top, they're dispersing information and it trickles down. And it's the beauty of Twitter especially, is it goes all directions. All sorts of people are tweeting, they can tag whoever they like. Oh, that's okay. And it can go up and down the chain really, really quickly, like instantly. So you can contact your governor. Almost all of our reps now have Twitter accounts. You don't like something? Hey, @rep so-and-so, I hate that this happened, XYZ hashtag. You can say something to your representative right there, searchable online, and we can also aggregate information. So whatever you do, please get on Twitter, social media, and start using it in a way that's gonna help empower yourselves and your communities. And we all know we don't have time, and so it's a great way to use the time that we have and teach others, especially since it's so free, and we know we all have so much money to spend at our agencies and organizations for budgets. So try to implement this in some way. And you can always contact me afterwards. I think we've got about 9 minutes for questions, comments. Anything else you want to cover?
So you mentioned that when you were running for office, the sort of lack of social work support out there in the primaries. And I guess I'm interested in what's the answer to that. So if I have an alumni community who's running for office, right now they can tweet that, but who's going to hear that? Where are they going to go? What do we need to create or do, or what's the mechanism to get the word out to somebody who's not sitting in this conversation, doesn't know these organizations exist, and may not even be contacting the college, right? Somebody in El Paso is running for office and they're a social worker. What are we going to do about that? Like, how are we going to help them?
A great question. I think that part of that is also going to be answered if they're running for state office or not. So the state, say state chapter NASW. I'm just using NASW as the horse to talk about right now. There's other ways to be doing this too. But the chapter for that state needs to be aware they're running. And then I think it's NASW's and our major organizations' responsibility to have a good network and recruit social workers in their districts to get the information out. And that this isn't rocket science. We have mailing lists, right? I mean, organizations have email, mailing lists, all of that. So getting that out, can you imagine how easy that is? You know, Susie Smith's running for state assembly in Texas, and it goes out to everyone on their list in Texas right now. And Facebook's another good one for passive information. You don't have to log into it. You know, when you like a page, they'll just go in your feed with everything else. And so I feel like Facebook is useful in that way, that they're not having to open an email, because we all know we don't want to open any more emails, especially with a political something in the subject line. So, but if NASW puts out a blast with a photo, Susie Smith's running in Texas, here she is, believes in X, Y, Z, and that goes through and everybody sees in their Facebook line, they're not opening up anything. It's just there.
I guess my question is, how do we make NASW do that? Because I have actually a student running for state rep, and alum running for state rep right now, and I can share with you. But you know, NASW is not saying, hey, who's running for office right here? And so we can want NASW to do this, but how do we make that happen? How do we bridge this? Because I think that's an important piece, because we know there's social workers around the country who have run for office, and they're not networked in and giving that support.
You know what I found when I was running for office is I asked a lot of questions just because it was happening at the time. I didn't have the training to know what do you do first, second, third, fourth. So I was kind of bumbling along finding out. But I had a lot of questions, and I ended up with more questions than answers. But I found that everyone I talked to, whether it was NASW, any other supporting organization, they didn't have the answers either. And so it wasn't that we don't want to support you. They just didn't have any mechanisms. No one had asked. And there were a couple of websites that I had gone through as a PACE or the others. It hadn't been updated since 2008 or something. And so I thought, wow, I guess we're not really doing much in this area. How disappointing. But it was good in that I found that out. But I think that there is a lot we can do without having to spend a lot of money to network that. And so, yeah, that's our challenge.
I think there's some really simple steps. I mean, I think getting an ASW to link us to, you know, all these different groups that are working about it is a very simple step, and we should be doing that. Because my state rep actually is a social worker, and she never identified as a social worker, and I invited her to this campaign school for the first time, and she was in tears. I mean, literally had no idea, because she's not a member of NASW, though. That's the other thing, is that, you know, a lot of macro folks don't join NASW. So it has to be outside of NASW. I'm not sure we have all the answers, but we've got to figure out a way to make that network, and that's got to be.
It can be a factor, because it's, like I said, only about 10% are following of all the social workers. We've got maybe 100,000 that are really following anything, and how close they're following, I don't know, because I know a lot of people have Twitter accounts aren't really paying attention. And so I can give you lots of tips that have nothing to do with that, to clean up your feed, because I know a lot of people get turned off by Twitter because they end up doing a bunch of things that waste your time. So that's a discussion for another day, but definitely email me or contact me, and I will help you. I'm just thinking this is the most important thing, because I know finances and time are the two things that turn everybody off to doing more of anything, and I know why, you know, but we have to do something if we want to make an impact, because a lot of the things we talk about doing are really time lengthy, and incorporating curriculum and all that's fantastic, and yes, we should revamp a lot of our classes and policy and all of that. That's a long game, which we need, but we also need to be focusing on, we have a clock for 2016. I'm not talking about the presidential vote. The other thing I have to educate people on is that's one thing, and yes, this gets a lot of the airtime, but what's happening in your ballot, what's happening in your neighborhood, and why does this matter? And then especially when primaries come up, you want change, you want something different, vote in the primaries. That's when all of the normal people are running and have no money. So if you actually want a normal person, you vote in the primaries, you don't wait for the big ones. So I'm done, but any questions for anybody up here, or comments or arguments?
I guess I would just add that there is space in the classroom for some of this. So, you know, as you were talking, I do caucus. I live in a caucus state. I do caucus training as part of policy every year. So if you're in my policy, if you're in any of my classes in the spring, we have a full caucus training. So Research gets caucus training, they're gonna learn how to do it if I'm not teaching policy that semester. That I have students do voter engagement on campus, because it's kind of back to Linda's point about having your clients run the dialogue, run the outreach. So rather than, I do voter registration, and I hand that out, they all get a voter registration card on their syllabus. Here's the first day of class, here's your class. They're not registered to vote. So that's the first step. And if they're gonna be in policy, they need to be registered. But then I've this year stepped it up, and they're running voter engagement on campus. And so far this semester, my students have registered 100 campus students. And we are now in the middle of a student identified and run, because I'm like, I don't know how to get the 19-year-olds to do something. Like, I don't know. And they're planning a flash mob, and they're doing YouTube videos, and they're doing all this stuff that I don't know what it is. But it's kind of back to your point. You have the clients name the method.
But just hearing this is what's important too, is that there's lots of things you can do, and people are doing them. And even talking to Tanya yesterday, when we were talking about some of the things they do, it's like we don't do that in the West Coast. It's just not as much as part of the culture, even though we have a huge set of the population there. Just getting that engagement is tough. So there's a lot of things we can do. We don't have all day to do it, but I think we could spend a lot of time on just trying to figure out how to do this. But all ideas are welcome. And we're also doing a post panel like in another hour online, and that's more to engage a lot of the students who aren't here, who aren't going to be at CSWE, but really need to be part of this conversation. And a lot of times we just exclude the ones we most need in the room in talking about this. Teenagers, ones they aren't even old enough to vote yet, but they're going to vote in 2 or 3 years. So.
Did we miss anything, Charles? Because you've been really involved in all this work for a long time.
I'll just say there is an effort underway to launch a voter empowerment campaign that would, be universal, and we'll have more to say about that on our website.
Yeah, follow Kristie on the Hill online. And then I'm also tweeting these out. If you have just old-fashioned email and you aren't Twitter yet, that's fine. I put a paper somewhere if you want to put your email address, your Twitter handle. I'll send out all of the information. You can have the YouTube video link, you can have the PowerPoints, all of it. And we'll start from there.
And let me just add on that voter empowerment campaign, because our work of developing the model is, we believe, is part of that work. And there's all kinds of opportunities for those of you who are out in the practice. Think about continuing education units on voter engagement. Think about, Charles is doing a lot of, and Kristie do a lot around social media and how to engage people. But there are shared materials. This is not rocket science. Partnering with folks like Nonprofit Vote that have national platforms. We should all have really accessible resources that we can be using, whether it's in an NASW training or in an agency setting training staff or in a classroom. They're not that crazy different. So how do we make it easy?
And even Rock the Vote's been doing it for years, and they send out specific information on state information, and now it's really easy to find where your voting location. There's a lot of just online tools, even if you're not on Twitter, that you can share with clients. So just getting everyone to do it there's a million of us. We have to start doing a whole lot better.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. There's cards and campaigns full information up here.
If you want to bring the campaigns forward. Well, I haven't been there. I'll be next down. You did? That is so good. Yay! Yeah. You are
Yes. Okay, great. I'm going to thank these folks, and then I have them.
It just makes it all better.
Thank you.
Thank you for being
Kristie, about 5 minutes.
You want me to write that?
Yeah, so I have a chapter. So chapter 1. What I would do is I've got to figure out how to turn that one section about it's not huge piece, but turn that into some sort of and then so that's what I would
Get out of
also, the Alliance for Justice is a wonderful organization. When I go to the library, I used to tell the IRS about this, and then I took it over to their team. So that is how.
Oh, that's great. So where?
Alliance for Justice.
Is it over there?
You know who's a JD? Senator Murphy?
No, B-O-L. Holder.
The caucus chain of definition is so
Yes, I saw you.
Thanks so much.
Yes. I saw you cross.
See you later.
Yeah.
Oh, so I do. Okay, get the, yes, no, I do.
No, your next one.
Great, yeah.
Sorry. Post them,
Yes.
Hey, Margaret. I know you are walking. I just wanted to introduce myself. We had a policy 2.0, and we ate dinner at that lovely place. And it's good
We have
Yes.